Hi, folks. As Andrea said, my name is Natalie Schultheis. I spent my summer doing research on medical negligence and cruel and unusual punishment, Eighth Amendment violations in what are known as criminal alien requirement prisons. Show of hands if anybody knows what a car prison is. Okay, great. So there's like 4 people. I did not know what those were until this summer. And so let me explain to you what those are. Criminal alien requirement prisons, first of all, they're federally run prisons. They're only for immigrants, and also they're all privately run. And I'm not talking about ICE detention. I'm talking about actual prisons run by the Bureau of Prisons. So I'm going to be saying car prisons, and that's what I'm talking about. This is a photo from a prison that I visited this summer, and I'll get to a little bit later about what's going on in this situation. And the 2 things other than the fact that these exist, that I want folks to take away today are, one, that the conditions of health and safety in these prisons are completely subpar and completely violate human rights. And secondly, the fact that these prisons discriminate on the basis of whether or not somebody is a US citizen should be impermissible. And so first question is, where are these prisons located? This I got off of the BOP, the Bureau of Prisons website last night, and it shows all of BOP's contract prisons in the US. So all of the prisons that are federally run, but are contracted out with private organizations. And actually every single one of these prisons that are privately run and through the federal government are car prisons, except for the one that is K, which also houses some non-citizens as well. But so I show this to let you know that when we talk about federal private prisons, we're really talking about immigrants. And so I next want to talk about a little bit about where the creation, when these prisons were created, where did this come from? Because we didn't always have car prisons. And you can't talk about car prisons without talking about the criminalization of undocumented border crossing, without talking about Operation Streamline. There was this idea in the federal government that we want to deter folks from crossing the border undocumented, and one way to do that would be to criminalize it, because if it's criminalized, then we can incarcerate you, and if there's the risk of being incarcerated and put in prison, maybe that will deter more people from crossing the border. And so what used to be a civil violation 25, 30 years ago, we now criminalize. The 2 terms they use are illegal entry, crossing the border undocumented, and illegal reentry, doing it more than once. And this policy came about with Operation Streamline that was implemented in 2005. And this graph shows how much federal prosecutions for illegal reentry have risen since Operation Streamline. It's risen by 183%. And that's just illegal reentry, that's not including illegal entry. About half of all car prisoners are there for nonviolent offenses, mostly for illegal entry and illegal reentry, some minor drug offenses. And also the proliferation of these car prisons has correlated directly with the privatization movement in prisons. A lot of NGO Group, MTC, CCA, 3 of the largest for-profit prison corporations in the country have lobbied for the criminalization of these offenses. And they're also all of the corporations that run these prisons as well. They're the ones that got the contracts. One reason that this is considered more profitable than housing other prisoners, than housing citizens, is because there's this idea that if they're a non-citizen and they're already going to receive an order of removal or deportation, that we don't have to provide them with reentry services and education and programs like that. And so whereas with a citizen, you have to provide those services with them, these corporations get to cut that cost out. So it's more profitable to incarcerate immigrants under this theory, and they don't provide those services in car prisons. And another issue that I think that has been really neglected in our conversation about for-profit prisons is we always talk about how profitable they are, and that's absolutely correct. But something that's missing from that we're missing is a conversation about what's in it for the government. What I think the government gets out of this is that they get to have contractor liability insulating them from being sued. So for instance, If you're a federally run prison and there's an 8th Amendment violation or there's medical negligence, you get to sue the government. Whether or not that's going to be successful is another question, but if you have another layer of liability insulating the federal government, you have to break through that liability to get to the federal government, which makes these lawsuits even more difficult and prevents folks from having impact litigation cases that can result in nationwide prison reform. That saves the government a lot of money, in my opinion. And so what have been the results of incarcerating folks under this car prison regime? This is a graph that came from a really great report that was put out by ACLU National and the ACLU of Texas 2 years ago. And it shows that the number of undocumented folks in federal prisons has skyrocketed ever since Operation Streamline. You can see between 2004 and 2005, it's just gone up since then. And you can see how we've been systematically incarcerating and deporting nonviolent offenders. The majority of folks in all federal private prisons are there for drug and immigration offenses, which are nonviolent offenses. And I also want to talk a little bit about this story. So to put this into perspective, I met a man this summer who had been a legal permanent resident, green card holder. So if we're talking about what kind of status that conveys to a person, it's the status just below a US citizen as far as the rights that they can be conveyed. He was convicted of possession of marijuana with intent to distribute. So it's hard to imagine another offense that's less serious and nonviolent. Because he was a green card holder, not a citizen, he was first stripped of that status and then sent to a car prison as opposed to another federally run prison. And I'm going to talk now about the kinds of violations that go on in these private prisons. So, it's important to know that when there is incentive to cut costs in these federal private prisons, we've seen in these car prisons huge violations of medical care and disproportionate use of solitary confinement. In these car prison contracts, it's required that 10% of bed space be reserved for solitary confinement. And that's alarming for a number of reasons. First of all, for the BOP run, the federal run counterparts, only about 5% of bed space is reserved for solitary confinement, which means that car prisons, you're 2 times more likely, there's 2 times more bed space in these car prisons for these nonviolent offenders. These are all low security facilities. So if you're in a car prison, it's twice as likely that somebody could end up in one of these solitary confinement facilities. And secondly, that's really concerning because these prisons are overcrowded, and so that has often resulted in folks being placed in solitary confinement, not because of any kind of infraction or violation, but simply because there's no room for you in the general population, so you're going to solitary. I also talked to folks who said they ended up, when I was doing some interviews with folks at the Reeves County facility that I showed you earlier, who ended up in solitary confinement for eating a donut they weren't supposed to eat, filing a grievance form, and also perceived disrespect towards staff members. And another huge issue with these car prisons is the medical understaffing. Doctors are expensive, they have degrees, we have to pay them more, and a lot of times there are no doctors in these facilities, and doctors are actually called from off-sites. And additionally, the other medical staff that is there is often, they just aren't qualified to the level that you would expect there to be full-time staff there to take care of these prisoners and all of their medical needs, and that leads to folks making bad decisions, trying to calculate, should I send them to the hospital? Is it bad enough? Do I want to spend that money? That's a calculation that you often see going on in these situations. And unfortunately, that is a calculation that went on in the case of Jesus Manuel Galindo. So Jesus Manuel Galindo was convicted for illegal reentry. He crossed the border undocumented more than once. And he was placed in the SHU, the self-contained housing unit, solitary confinement. Jesus Manuel Galindo had a history of seizures and epilepsy, and according to his family, they had notified the prison officials more than 25 times of his medical needs and his need for better treatment and medication. This is a quote that he wrote the day before he passed away in a letter to his family. He said, "I get sick here by being locked up all by myself. They don't even know, and I am all bruised up. The medical care here is no good, and I'm scared." The next day, Jesus Manuel was found dead in his cell. He was 32 years old. In reaction to Jesus Manuel Galindo's death, prisoners rioted. That's what you saw in the first photo that I showed you all here. Although the government never investigated into his cause of death, they did prosecute the rioters. In the facility I've been talking about, Reeves County, it's just one, but from August 2008 to March 2007, 5 men died. That's 5 men in 7 months in a private facility. There's been some really great research by a Nation journalist, Seth Freed Wessler, on this topic. He submitted a FOIA request for records of 103 men who died in these car prisons. And he found that in 25 of those cases, a panel of independent medical reviewers identified signs of inadequate care that most likely contributed to their premature death. Thankfully, there was a DOJ memo, Department of Justice memo, that was handed out, that was made public in August of this year, that said that the federal government is going to begin phase out of these private prison contracts for federal private prisons with the BOP. And that is great, but it's also not enough. We can't have prisons where we're only placing non-citizens just because it's cheaper. We don't have to provide them services, so it saves us money. We need to abolish these car prisons. No more disparate death. Thank you.